Okay. Good morning, class. Good to see you today. So I want to pick up here in where we left off last time in chapter 10. Maybe we'll get to chapter 11 today. But in chapter 10, we were talking about externalities. And, here we're talking about people who are affected, people outside of the market for a particular good or service who are affected by the activity that's going on in that market. So they're neither a buyer nor a seller, but they bear a cost or reap a benefit from market activity. So again, positive externalities, those are sometimes we overlook those, but if your neighbor down the street finally paints his house, then that could actually enhance your property value. That would be an example of a positive externality. Negative externalities, kind of the classic example we looked at last time, were a couple of factories on the river and they're dumping glop in the river. Okay, it's just kind of part of the modern production environment we live in today. Pollution is a necessary evil, but the people who pay actually, or that is, who bear the cost of pollution aren't necessarily the ones who participate in the market, because you have people downstream who drink the water and so forth, and their health is adversely affected and they bear a cost. Maybe they have to go to the doctor or what have you. Or their lives are shortened, heavens, because of the activity going on at that plant where they maybe produce steel or paper or whatever it is, but they're neither a buyer nor a seller of that. Okay, they're not participating in the market. So there's an example of a negative externality. We could sit here really all day and conjure up all kinds of scenarios that would involve both positive and negative externalities. But we as economists, we try to correct what we call, actually we'll see later, we'll use the term market failure, where the market fails to provide the optimal quantity of the good being traded, because again, not everyone's vote's going to count. And so we looked last time at how that old supply and demand curve, where they intersect in a market and that equilibrium point that the invisible hand drives things to, that quantity does not correspond to the social optimum quantity. So go back and look at that if you would. But again, we have ways of attempting to correct, if you will, for the failure of the market to produce the socially optimal outcome. So you may have regulation. That's kind of a command and control approach, if you will, regulation. You may have market approaches whereby the government either auctions off or perhaps just distributes a certain number of pollution permits to factories who dump glop in the river, and then allows those companies to trade. Okay, and if a company or a factory that finds itself with production technology that enables it to remove pollution fairly easily, may take its permits and sell them or trade them, okay, with another factory for which it's expensive. We're going to look at an example of that in a minute, where we're trading pollution permits, okay? So at any rate, where we left off last time was with private solutions to externalities. And I gave you this hypothetical situation here. I attempted to draw a picture here of the situation. So let's do this, if I can get all this on here. So we have Emily and Horace, and Emily has a dog, so there's my feeble attempt at drawing a dog, and they live down the street from each other. So there's Emily and Horace. Emily loves her dog. She derives a benefit of $1,000 a month from her dog. Okay, so if she had to rent the dog and she could afford it, I guess that's what she'd pay to have that dog, what have you. That's her benefit. If we can quantify such a thing, that's her best attempt at doing that. Poor Horace lives down the street, and he hears the dog bark all night, so he can't sleep, so that imposes a cost of $1,500 on him. Okay, so first off, you know, there's air between here, obviously, and what we're going to see here is that if essentially if we can assign property rights to the medium between these two parties here, if we can establish basically some sort of property rights here, then the socially efficient outcome can always be achieved in a private market setting. Okay? In other words, let these two people here come to some sort of private agreement. Now we're going to see some conditions on that in a minute. We're going to see that essentially, for instance, lawyers get in the way. Okay? In other words, if these two people can come together and strike a deal without incurring transactions cost, hiring lawyers would be one. We'll look at some others here in a minute. Maybe there's several horses down the street. There's several people affected by the dog, and there's a cost associated with getting all those people together, okay? But if you have no transactions cost, then there's a private market solution to this thing if we establish property rights here to the medium between the two parties. Now the socially optimum outcome here would be that there'd be no dog, right? I mean, what is best for society here? We'll look at both cases here, but in this first case, since Horace pays a cost greater than the benefit derived by Emily, then you know the best thing for society as a whole, just kind of restricting our field of view here of society to these two people, is that there'd be no dog. Okay, so this is actually Ronald Coase's assertion here. We'll look at Coase's theorem here in a second. But basically he said, if someone essentially has property rights to the air between these two, and there are no transactions costs, so property rights are well defined and there are no transactions costs, these two people can come together and they don't have to hire a lawyer. They don't have to get a lot of people together. Maybe there's a bunch of dog owners or there's a bunch of people who can't sleep, okay? That would involve a cost if you try to get those people together. But at any rate, in the absence of those kind of costs, then there's a market solution to this thing that will drive us to the socially optimum case. All right, so here's the first off where the socially optimal outcome is basically no pollution, if you will, no noise pollution, okay? So how could we achieve that? Okay, well, first off, you know, and I've written this down here, let's just put it this way. If Emily has the property rights to the air, so assume Emily has the property rights to the air between the two houses, then Horace can pay Emily to keep her to shut up her dog, okay? But how much would Horace have to pay Emily? Can you tell? He'd have to pay at least $1,000. But if he paid her more than $1,000 to get rid of her dog, she would get rid of her dog because the benefit she's driving is only $1,000. So Horace could pay Emily $1,000, and he would probably pay $1,000 or more than $1,000, but up to $1,500. Okay, he wouldn't pay more than the cost he's already bearing because of the barking dog. Okay, so first off, Horace can strike a deal with Emily. I've written it this way: Horace can pay X dollars, where X is between $1,000 and $1,500. Okay, so he'll pay at least $1,000. That's Emily's not going to shut up her dog for less than $1,000 because she derives the benefit of $1,000. But then again, he'll not pay more than $1,500 because that's the size of the cost he's currently bearing. So maybe $1,200. So Horace may pay Emily $1,200 to shut up for her to shut up her dog. Okay, maybe cart the dog off to the nearest Waldorf Astoria, but it's Waldorf Astoria. But I always, wanted to. Here I'm giving away a trade secret. Here, I'll just tell you for a minute. I've always wanted to trademark the term Waldorf Astoria, and that make a great name for a pet hotel, would it not? But at any rate, if you go ahead and market that idea, well, more power to you, because I've sat on that for too many years. But at any rate, she may cart her dog off to the nearest pet hotel. She'd be happy to do that if she received $1,200, because her current benefit is only $1,000, okay? All right, so that would be a private solution there. If Emily has the property rights, what if Horace has the property rights here? Okay, now remember, the socially optimal outcome here is no dog. Now, if Horace owned the property rights to the heir, then he would insist that he be paid at least how much? Okay, if he has property rights to the heir, well, Emily's not going to pay him enough to let him allow her to have that dog. Okay, in other words, Emily will not pay enough to remove this cost to Horace, which is currently $1,500. She's only deriving a benefit of $1,000 for having the dog. So she's not going to pay $1,500 to keep her dog. Okay, so Horace, if somehow Horace owned this heir here, then, that is, he has the property rights to the heir, then Emily will not pay enough to Horace to incline him to allow the dog. You can omit this little thing right here. I'm writing a note to myself. But so the point here is, whoever owns the heir, if that's possible, we'll talk about in a minute how that could be possible. But regardless of whoever owns the heir, there's a market solution to be had here that achieves the socially optimal outcome. No dog in this case, because you know, the cost to Horace for listening to the dog is greater than the benefit Emily derives from having the dog. So this is the socially optimal outcome. And the point here again is that regardless of who owns the heir, okay, they can come together and eliminate the dog. In both cases here, the dog is removed. Okay, can you read my writing here today? Now, how could one of these parties own the heir, essentially? Okay, when we talk about Emily owning the heir, first off, if she has property rights, that essentially would be affected if in the city here there were no ordinance against barking dogs. You know, Horace may complain, but she says, well, go ahead, sue me, what have you. The law's not going to be on your side, the law's going to be on my side. If the law is on Emily's side, she essentially owns the heir, okay? So even in that case, all right, if she has those property rights, Horace can pay her at least $1,000 and she'll shut up her dog. Or if Horace owns the heir, okay, now how might that be affected? Well, if there is an ordinance in town that says a barking dog, you know, can't be above 50 decibels, okay, if you can hear it 100 feet down the street, you got to get rid of your dog. We can all imagine a city ordinance of that type. So in that case, Horace would essentially have property rights to the heir between their two houses. Now, the only way the city ordinance is going to be executed here is if somebody complains. So Horace has been not sleeping at night. He starts to complain. He says to Emily, though, I'll let you keep your dog if you pay me enough, but she's got to pay him $1,500, okay? $1,500 is the cost he bears for listening to the dog. So he's got to have at least $1,500 to listen to that dog, where he's better off. Emily's not going to pay that, though. Emily only derives a benefit of $1,000 for having her dog bark, okay? For just having her dog. So Emily's not going to pay Horace enough to keep her dog. So again, we achieve the socially optimal outcome here, regardless, okay, of who has the property rights. Okay, this is Coase's theorem. I'm going to write it. Your book states Coase's theorem on page 204. I think I'll give you a little more definite statement of Coase's theorem, but Coase's theorem is the proposition that if private parties can bargain without cost, okay, so again, we had no transactions, no lawyers got in the way, okay, here, or there was no cost, again, by trying to drum up support for one side or the other by getting people together. They can solve the problem of externalities. In this case, we have this negative externality of noise pollution. They can solve this problem on their own. Okay? So this is stated in your book, okay? So you have that. Maybe, I think, a more precise statement of Coase's theorem. Let me put it up here. I wrote this before class, so please forgive my, please forgive my handwriting here, but here we go. This is Coase's theorem. Ronald Coase won the Nobel Prize in Economics. I think it was in 1991. This is a very famous theorem of his. He did study economics at the London School of Economics, but what's notable about him, he was at the University of Chicago, was that he's really a lawyer, okay? He's an attorney, and that was his primary gig, if you will, and then he got into economics some, and of course this made him famous, this realization here that, you know, if you establish property rights in a situation where there's externalities, then there's basically a free market solution here to the problem. You can get to the global maximum. That's a technical term. It's a math term. You can arrive at the socially optimal outcome here if the parties can get together. So in a world with no transactions cost, bargaining between parties involved in a dispute over property rights will lead to an efficient outcome regardless of the initial allocation of those rights. Okay, so we saw this here with Emily and Horace. Horace, though, in this case we just looked at, bore a cost to listening to the barking that exceeded Emily's benefit. You're going to get the same thing here if we change this problem up just a little bit. Okay, so let me change this problem up just a little bit. It's the same picture, except Emily's benefit now is not $1,000, it's $3,000. Of course, the cost to Horace to listen to the dog is still $1,500. So this is going to change the social optimum, right? What is best for society here? That the dog be allowed to bark, or the dog be carted off to the Waldorf Astoria? What do you think? Be carted. Best for society is that the dog barks, right? I mean, there's some cost over here, but the benefit to part of society exceeds the cost to the other part, the other half of society. So we would call this the socially optimal result here. The social optimum is to let the dog bark. Okay, let the dog bark. Okay, now, Coase's theorem would say that so long as someone, one of these two parties here, has essentially property rights to the air between those two houses, and there are no transactions costs, and the parties can come together and they can work out kind of a free, if you will, a free market, a free path to solution here that doesn't involve the government, okay, government regulation or anything like that. They'll strike a deal that will achieve this socially optimal outcome. All right, so let's look at how it works in this case. So this is a different scenario, right? Because I changed this from 1,000 to 3,000. So that affected the social optimum here. So here is to let the pollution, in this case noise pollution, let the pollution continue. You know, sometimes that's what's best for society anyway. We would all love to live in a world with no pollution, zero, zippo. But alas, that's not the world we live in, nor is it really right now the world we want to live in, really, because no solution means you give up your cell phones and your laptops and your air conditioning and everything else, right? Your way of life. So we could go back to a primitive existence, but that's not the way the time arrow of humanity has pointed. So, at any rate, so some pollution may be the socially optimal outcome. In this case, let the dog bark, we're going to see is, or we do see, is the best thing for society. How would that be achieved kind of in a private sort of way? Well, first off, remember now, Emily derives $3,000 worth of benefit from the dog. Horace pays a cost of $1,500 for the dog. So if Emily has property rights to the air, then Horace will not pay enough to Emily to make her shut up her dog. Okay? Remember again, Emily has $3,000 benefit, and the cost of Horace is only $1,500. So he would pay anything up to, but not over $1,500 to get the dog carted off. So the dog is going to stay in the neighborhood. That's if Emily has the property rights. If Horace has the property rights to the heir, then Emily will pay enough to Horace to let her keep her dog. So in other words, if Horace can shut down that dog, go to the city hall, what have you, hey, there's an ordinance over here, shut that dog off, up, and so they can send the dog pound guy out, cart the dog off. Emily runs down the street, wait, okay, I will pay you. She will willingly pay up to how much? How much would she pay? Up to what amount to strike a deal with Horace to let her keep her dog? What do you think? How much? Okay, all right, well, she would have to pay at least $1,500, wouldn't she? But she would pay up to $3,000, wouldn't she? Okay. All right, she'd pay up to, if she had to pay $2,900, her benefit would still exceed her cost. Okay. So she will pay enough. She'll pay up to $3,000, which would exceed the cost of Horace. So she goes, I'll pay you $2,000. Horace is going to say, okay, $2,000, I'll get me a hotel room certain nights of the week. Yeah, we can make this work. Give me $2,000. She'll do that. She gets to keep her dog. Okay, that's the point right here. She gets to keep her dog, which is the socially optimal outcome. Never mind this little scribble I've got here. The point here, I wrote myself a note to be sure and let you know that, again, the social optimum is obtained regardless of who has the property rights. Okay? So regardless of who has the property rights. So in this second case here, Horace would have essentially the property rights, again, if there were an ordinance that he could appeal to at City Hall that would cause Emily to shut up her dog. All right, so you might have to give this a little thought here. I don't know, this is kind of a thumbnail sketch I had here, just one of many examples here. I guess I could scan this and put it up as an attachment on Blackboard. Would that help? Okay, kind of give you an example here of Coase's theorem. There's lots of applications of Coase's theorem, though, out there in any situation where you have some sort of negative externality in particular. You got pollution. There's also for positive externalities, but a deal is to be had if property rights can be assigned and there are no transactions cost. A lot of times when we think of externalities, we're thinking in a negative sort of way, negative externalities. Again, you can have positive externalities. There are free market approaches to solving these, like with positive externalities. Your book gives the example of an apple orchard near a bee farm. What do you call those, apiaries or something like that? They have a bunch of bees, make honey. And now there's a symbiotic relationship here, I guess, if I can use that term, is that, the bees can produce more honey because there's pollen over here on these plants, on the trees. But you can grow more apples and have more apple trees because the bees pollinate the trees. So one is good for the other. Bees are good for apple trees are good for bees. So if you want to know that in a little more detail, study your botany, take a botany class. Dr. J is not a botanist. But the point here is that there are positive externalities between these two, okay? The orchard benefits because of the bee farm, what the bees are doing. The bee farm benefits because of the trees in the orchard. So if you think about it a little bit, if you just look at one direction there, say from the orchard owner, he's looking over there at the bee farm and says, boy, I wish he would grow more bees, because that's a good thing what those bees are doing. And the bee farm's looking over at the orchard owner and saying, I wish he'd plant more apple trees. That's good for me. So there's positive externalities going both ways. You have some situations like this. There aren't too many to think of, but this is one. And so one way to achieve this thing, social outcome, if you will, something that's good for both parties, because after all, both parties want more of what the other one's doing, all right? And we've seen that when there are positive externalities, just a free market approach tends to underprovide those goods that exhibit positive externalities. You know, we'd all benefit if our neighbors planted a flower bed okay, in their front yard, but alas, you know, it's kind of hard to get your neighbor to do those things. Sometimes there's not really very many ways to do that. In this case, each person may say, I don't know how I can get my neighbor to do what's good for me, but there's positive externalities going both ways. Well, what if they got together somehow, or one bought the other one out? Okay, they come together and merge, or one party buys the other one out. So you got something of a conglomerate here, I guess. We're producing apples and honey. Okay, now if you think about that, if you had a single owner that sells both apples and honey, then of course they're going to plant as many apple trees and grow as many bees as they can. They continue to benefit from that. So they're not looking at this problem in a parochial way. They're not looking at a single market. This person who now owns the combined business has a more global perspective on things. They're looking to maximize profit for themselves across two markets, both for honey and for apples, okay? And so in that case, it certainly would be to their benefit to have more of both, okay? Because each good produces a positive externality. Sometimes there are those private solutions like that where we say we internalize the externality. So there's an externality here that gets internalized, that is the best outcome is achieved when the parties come together and work it out without government regulation, without even, you know, any kind of government control in the situation. So we saw this here with Horace and Emily as well. When you have a negative externality associated with, well, basically noise pollution, we were able to internalize that negative externality by letting the parties come together. But the only way that was achievable is if someone has essentially a property right. Now that's the problem. There's a problem there, okay? As far as Coase's theorem being feasible in the real world, or applications of it being feasible, is a lot of times establishing property rights is not really a feasible, I'm using that word again, but a feasible condition. I mean, who owns the oceans? Okay, it would be nice perhaps if there were private ownership of the North Pacific. Okay, now you go out there, I understand there's a bunch of trash floating around in the North Pacific. Why is there a bunch of trash floating around? We're going to look at this in a little more detail in the next chapter when we look at public goods and common goods and so forth. But the thing is, you know, nobody really owns the ocean, okay? There's no one to assert property rights. When no one is around to assert property rights effectively in a situation like that, then there's always a party around who can pollute with impunity. Okay? So, you know, the establishment of property rights is the critical condition for achieving this optimal outcome, as Ronald Coase would have said. So Ronald Coase kind of came upon this insight, and for this he was rewarded, primarily for this he was rewarded with the Nobel Prize in economics back there. So at any rate, there's lots of applications of this. Okay, so private solutions to externalities. Last time we also looked at corrective taxes and so forth. Other market-based approaches for correcting for negative externalities in particular. So we did look on page 200. I've marked my book up quite a bit, but we're going to work a problem here in a minute, where we have kind of a market approach for correcting for too much of a negative externality by introducing a corrective tax. We talked about the Pagovian tax and so forth. So you can either affect a corrective tax. If you set the tax at the right level, then you get the right quantity of this good here, the interesting good. The quantity of pollution is the good that's being traded. So we assess a tax against, that particular good. If it's high, if we tax pollution really high, we say each ton of glop you're going to have to pay that you dump in the river here, you're going to have to pay a tax of $1 bazillion. Then, I mean, this line is way up here and nobody's going to pollute, okay? But if there's a low tax, then every factory along the Arkansas River is going to pollute. Okay, so setting this corrective tax will get you the right amount of pollution, if you will. In this case, recall, we won't go back through the story, but it was 600 tons. I remember when I was a boy, I took our scout troop took a cabin. We were on a cabin cruiser, and we went down the Arkansas River. And so I was. This is how old I am, but this would have been about 1970, okay, before your parents were born. But I remember seeing all this gunk on the river, floating from Tulsa all the way down past Muskogee. We went. Muskogee's my hometown, so we get on the cabin cruiser in Muskogee. We went down to Weber Falls, went through the lock and dam. It was quite an experience. But I remember seeing this garbage on the river, this foamy stuff, and I thought it was terrible. But what we had really, especially in the early 70s, under the Nixon administration, I alluded to this last time, but we had the rise of the Environmental Protection Agency. And so the government got involved in some of this stuff, and you don't really see so much of that today. In the United States, the government has been effective, certainly, in controlling the amount of pollution in our environment. You got to realize that a clean environment, though, is an income normal good. Okay? The United States is a wealthy nation. We individually, our income is pretty high, and so because of that, we can afford a clean environment. Okay, so it's an income. You remember what income normal goods are? You want more of something when your income goes up, and so in the United States, along with our increase in income, we've been enjoying a greater amount of this good called a clean environment. So at any rate, one way of getting to that, kind of a long story here, is by setting these corrective taxes. Also, pollution permits is another way of getting the desired amount of pollution in the river. In this case, right, how much pollution you want in the river, so you issue some permits to your factories here. And I mentioned, here's the little dots I had last time, but I mentioned how through an auctioning process here, those permits could be auctioned to firms, and if you have so many of these pollution permit cards to auction off to maybe it's 600 tons again, then the firms that are the dirtiest, the ones that not only are the dirtiest, but I would say find it the most costly to clean up, will pay the highest price for those permits. Okay. And so you wind up, if you do it this way here, you can wind up, if you let these permits be traded between the people who buy them or who are issued them, if you let them trade them amongst themselves, you can clean up the river at a lower cost. Okay? There's a problem that'll illustrate this. Let's look at problem number 9 here on page 209, problem number 9. Okay, so we have here, it says here that there are 3 industrial firms in Happy Valley, firms A, B, and C. Here's their initial level of pollution. Here's the cost of reducing pollution by 1 unit. And so you see right away that firm B here, it's very difficult for them to reduce their pollution by 1 unit. They're the worst polluter. And then because of their production technology, it's harder for them to install air scrubbers or what. I guess are they dumping in a river? I don't know. It doesn't say, but this is a big thing like with coal generated electricity plants and so forth. They have to put these scrubbers in the stacks, and you used to see a lot more. I used to see a lot more sulfur coming out of the stacks. At least I thought I did. There in the power plant in my hometown, could see it. I didn't worry about the steam coming off those radiators. It's that yellow stuff comes out of the stacks. So, but at any rate, there's increases in technology and so forth that make removing pollution a lot cheaper. But it depends on the industry. So these perhaps 3 different industries here represented by the 3 firms. B is the worst offender, and then it's the most difficult for them to clean up. So it says here the government wants to reduce pollution to 60 units. So it gives each firm 20 tradable pollution permits. Now, you know, at first blush, that sounds like a pretty simple solution there. Let each firm here pollute 20 units. So they get a permit for each unit, 20 units apiece, so that there's what? 60. They want to reduce to 60 units. 20 times 3 is 60. Okay, so they could issue those permits. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to work 2 parts of this problem. First off, we're going to let these 3 firms trade their permits. Okay, some may sell to the others, and there may be some buyers. So we're going to issue 2 permits, 20 permits, I guess, to each one, and they're going to let them trade. So the question is, who sells the permits, and how many will they sell, and so forth. So we're at this situation back here. Remember this picture here? We're at this situation here where you have a fixed number of pollution permits here. We want 60 units of pollution a month to go in the environment. 20 times 3, 60. So you got a fixed amount right here at 60. But you have different costs associated with cleaning up the environment, which will establish the second curve in that picture. Let me go back here again. This demand curve, okay? The supply of permits is fixed. It's perfectly inelastic. 60 units of pollution fixed. What we're going to do now to determine who buys and sells those permits is we're going to find out what permits are valued the most and which permits are valued the least amongst these 3 factories. Okay, so we're going to chart that demand curve. Okay, so, you know, like with anything else, a demand curve. In fact, I have drawn a picture of this already. And let's see, I kind of want to go through the process. So let's draw this demand curve here for pollution. So this is, the good is pollution. Okay, that may sound kind of wild, but this is pollution. Okay, so we want 60 units. Here in a minute, I'll put it 60 here, and we'll draw that vertical line. But I'm going to draw the demand curve first. So this is the price. Always put price on the vertical axis. So price of pollution. Okay, now in other words, the good really is a permit to pollute. Okay, a permit to pollute. And when you look at these 3, you know, like trading cards or something like that, but when you look at these 3 firms here, you see that firm B would buy 40 permits, and they're the ones who'd pay the highest price. So if you're going to chart a willingness to pay curve, which is really what a demand curve is, you see that at a price of $30, okay, just going back here to this number right here, at a price of $30, you're going to have 4 permits that are going to be well demanded. So I'm going to put 4 numbers here corresponding to 10, 20, 30, and 40. Does that make sense? Now I could connect those, I guess, but really these 4 permits here would be demanded by firm B. So I'm going to put a B here at a price of $30. Does that make sense, class? So I'm charting a willingness to pay curve. All right? And firm B would pay $30 for each one, because to reduce its pollution by 1 unit, it's going to cost them $30. Okay? The firm next, with the next highest willingness to pay, would be firm A. Okay? They need 3 permits, and each one of those they'd pay $20 for. Okay? So what we have here are 3 points here. I'm going to move down just a little bit here at $20. And I'm going to put 1, 2, 3 here. This represents firm A. Okay? A. Because again, and you can connect these if you want, but it's kind of like the demand curve looks like this, if you will. Okay? You can't sell half of a permit, though. So the points between the dots don't really have that much relevance to us. Now firm C here, firm C would pay $10 for 2 permits. See that? So I'm going to come down here to $10. And let's see here. Let's just 40, 50, 60, 70 pollution permits here. So the next 10 and 20, if I can squeeze these in, would give us 80 to 90. These would be purchased by firm C. And here we go. All right, so I could kind of connect this here. This would be, if you will, the demand for pollution permits. The good, again, is a pollution permit. That's the good. Think of it again as a trading card. The card says good for 10 tons of glop. All right. All right, now what we see here is we can tell who's going to buy the permits, who's going to sell the permits by looking at who values these the most. And how many are going to be sold and purchased will be determined by where we put that supply of permits curve. There's 60 units that the government's going to allow. So that's where we get the supply curve, which goes right through here. The supply of pollution permits. Supply of permits. That makes sense? And this is the demand for permits. Okay, now you have a perfectly inelastic supply curve, but certainly if I tilted this a little bit, we're used to looking at this, wherever the demand curve is higher than the supply curve, and then that's a unit that's going to be traded, right? And so these units here, right here, okay, now these two are already owned by B, but you'll notice here, I'll put 2 circles here around this. B, since it's already given 2 permits, but it wants 4, B is going to purchase 2 permits from somebody. B will purchase 2 permits from somebody. Now A has 2, but it really doesn't need this one here. We're going to see in a minute. And neither does C, okay? So what happens here, let's do this in steps, is first off, B will, if trading is allowed, okay, trading may not be allowed. We're going to compare these in a minute, but suppose trading is allowed. Kind of smudged my ink there just a little bit. If trading is allowed, then we see that firm B will purchase 2 permits. B will purchase 2 permits. Now, who are they going to purchase it from? Well, from one of the other firms, okay? But they don't really clean up the river, okay? This isn't going to clean up the river yet, okay? But you also got firms A and C. Now, what are these firms going to do here, okay? B needs 2 more permits, okay? C is certainly, if we look at C next, C will not pollute because they can sell their permits to firm B for up to $30. And if you think about that just a second, then if C, which derives a benefit of $10 per permit, can, instead of using the permit, sell it to B for $30, then C will do so. So C will not pollute. Instead, they'll sell their 2 or 20 permits to B. Okay? I'm sorry about that. All right? So at any rate, they'll sell it at a cost, and the only way they can do this is if C says they're not going to pollute, and that's when it's going to cost them to not pollute. It always costs to not pollute. So the total cost here would be 20 of these $10 permits. So the total cost here would be 20 permits times $10 each. That sounds like $200. So the first thing we see here is that C is going to sell its permits to B. B's not going to clean up. But for C to clean up, it's going to cost $200. So these 2 permits go here, okay? Maybe this one and this one. And then firm A here, they only got 2 permits. So they got a permit here they can't sell. So all they're going to do is reduce their pollution by 10 units. So A will reduce pollution, just like C did, but they're not going to sell their permit. They don't have anything to do with their permit, okay? They don't have anyone to sell it to. It could be that C sells one and A sells another and so forth, but it's most likely here that B is going to buy their permits from C because C will sell it at a lower cost, a lower price, right? They're going to go to C before they go to A. B will go to C before they go to A to buy their permits that they need to continue doing what they're doing. They may be able to get them for $12 each. Okay? So, but A is forced to reduce its solution, and it'll give up. You know, it only has 2 permits here. So at a cost of 10 units of pollution, they got to give up, going from 70 to 60. And remember what the cost per unit for A is? A is $20. So this is 10 times 20. $20. This also is 200. Okay, so essentially what happens is, I can put an X here, here, and here, if you will. C is going to not pollute because they're going to sell their permits to B. So that's going to cost C 20 units times $10 a unit. So that's $200. A, well, they have a permit here, but there's no buyer because these 2 permits went to B. But the government only gave them 2 permits or 20 units, so they have to clean up, okay? And their cost of cleaning up is 20 units or 10 units of pollution at $20 a unit right here. So I put an X on those 3. So what's the total cost of cleaning up the river? $400. Now, how many units of pollution are in the river? 60, okay? But what's happened is, the firm that incurs the least cost per unit to remove from the river is going to drop out of the market, essentially. They're not going to pollute. And they're going to allow the firm that incurs the greatest cost. Now, maybe firm B is locked into some sort of technology and they can't get scrubbers for their smokestacks. Maybe there's a different, maybe lead comes out of their smokestack instead of sulfur dioxide. I don't know. But for some reason, it's very costly for firm B to clean up. So it doesn't have to in this case. The goal for the government is still achieved. There's only 60 units of pollution in the river. Now this is if trading is allowed. What if there were no trading allowed? Okay, let's think about that a second. In other words, remember that A, B, and C are issued 20 pollution permits. So trading after that, suppose, is not allowed. So you still got, I'm going to do it in the same order, B, A, and C. Doesn't really matter that much. But B will reduce by 20 units. They've got, you know, they're polluting at 40, so now they got to get rid of half of what they're doing. So B will reduce by 20 units. A will reduce by 10 units. Okay? Will C have to reduce any of their activity? If each firm is issued 20 pollution credits, that's exactly what they're polluting, right? And if trading's not allowed, they just continue to pollute. So C will not reduce. Okay, does that make sense, first off? This is the amount of pollution each firm or factory is going to reduce their pollution by. So factory B by 20 units, 20 fewer units of glop in the river each month. A, okay, we got to remove 10 because we only have permits for 20 units, not 30, okay, as you see up here, and so forth. Okay, so what's the total cost here? Well, the cost for each of these, I'll just put an arrow here, is first off 20 for B. Remember the cost for B is $30 a unit to clean up. So this is 20 times 30, which is $600. Ooh, wow. Just for B to clean up, to go from 4 to, to 40 units to 20 units, that's $600. A, there's 10 units. Remember that's $20 a unit for A, this is $200. And C is not going to reduce at all, so there's no cost associated with B or C cleaning up because it doesn't clean up. So you add these up, you get $800. Okay, you achieve the same goal. There's how many units of glop in the river? 60, okay, just as there was before. But look, a lot of that cost is imposed on B now, where before it wasn't, because B was able to purchase additional permits from another member of the club. So this kind of command and control approach here that achieves this same outcome here as far as the environment is concerned is much more costly for the private side of this problem. Okay, so it's going to affect the stock price and so forth. It's going to affect, before that, it's going to affect the bottom line on the income statements for these firms right here, because the expenses, the operating expenses here for these firms are higher than they are up here. So this is a more efficient way. I mean, this is just kind of a thought example, if you will, a thought problem of how we can achieve this optimal outcome in a more efficient way. And trading or pollution permits are great, but again, perhaps we can achieve that ideal amount of pollution in the environment by letting firms or businesses trade their permits to pollute. And you get that outcome at a much less costly way. This is the theory behind cap and trade and so forth. You hear the terms cap and trade used when you talk about environmental pollution and so forth, even on a global level. And we don't need to get into the specifics here so much today, but the Kyoto Protocol and all of these things you hear about in the news, cap and trade approaches to pollution can be, and the U.S. pulled out of that one, but the point here is there have been cap and trade approaches implemented for achieving this best outcome for the environment at a less costly way. You used to see a lot more acid rain in the Northeast because of power plants in the Northeast, burning high sulfur coal. And even if you go to the old cemeteries and you see the tombstones up there, one time they used to erode away pretty quick because of that acid rain hitting those carbonate stones or whatever. There's a certain amount of, I guess it's carbon in those stones that dissolve in the acid rain, in the sulfuric acid or sulfurous acid that's produced in the environment when you burn coal and so forth. So, but at any rate, you don't see so much of that anymore, and because of this particular approach that has been implemented by regulatory authorities, the EPA and so forth, that allow coal plants to trade pollution permits. Okay. So anyway, this is just kind of an example, a thought example of how a market-based approach is perhaps superior to a strictly regulatory approach. There's some other problems here. We got a little bit of time we might look at just to make sure we got an idea on this. I guess problem number 8 kind of follows on the heels of this just a little bit. I'll tell you what, let's go to 7. Let's go to 7, then we'll do 8. I think we can do each of these. So problem 7 alludes to this diagram we were just looking at in your book. They call it figure 4, I think. Figure 4, again, remember the corrective tax, the horizontal supply curve there, or the fixed number of permits with the vertical supply curve. Figure 4 shows that for any given demand curve for the right to pollute, the government can achieve the same outcome either by setting a price with a corrective tax or by setting a quantity with pollution permits, okay? So suppose there's a sharp improvement in the technology for controlling pollution. We want to use these graphs here they give us to determine the result here of that sharp improvement in technology, you know, for removing pollution. So they say, first off, use the graph similar to those in Figure A. Illustrate the effect of this development on the demand for pollution rights. Okay, so for instance, if we go back here just a second to our picture, Figure 4, they're talking about, sorry for all my writing. I really write when I read. But here we go. There's the picture. Whoops. Okay. So there's a corrective tax here. And the point here is, I mean, it's actually a simple problem. They're asking you, there's this increase in technology in removing pollution. There's a new scrubber that's been invented for the smokestacks. Okay, that would be an example. Or there's a new filter that really is good at removing that glop in the effluent that gets dumped in the river. How's that going to affect the price and the quantity of permits that would be solicited by these firms and so forth, okay? So in other words, if you had an improvement in the technology, in either case, then there's going to be a left shift in the demand curve for permits. This would be D1 and this would be D2. This would be an improvement in technology, would affect a smaller demand for pollution permits. Okay? The smaller demand for those. So it doesn't matter what your approach is, okay? If your approach is this approach here, which we see in the first panel, where you have a corrective tax, okay? A corrective tax is essentially a perfectly elastic supply of pollution permits. You can always buy them at a fixed cost, but they're there, you can buy them. You can buy however many you want, but you got to pay a certain amount for that. Then what we see is that we're going to move from this equilibrium point to this equilibrium point here. So there'll be fewer permits solicited by the firms that are polluting the river. That is, there'll be a decreased amount of pollution. Okay? So there'll be a decrease amount of pollution. However, the cost to pollute is not going to be affected. Right? But the cost to pollute is really not affected. On a per unit basis, the cost to pollute per unit is unaffected. Okay? In other words, it still costs $30 a ton of glop. You can put as much glop in the river as you want, but it's going to cost you whatever this price is. Maybe it's $30. So just, you need to dump a bunch more glop in the river, go buy permits. Or now with the increase in technology, you say, we don't need to dump as much glop in the river, so buy fewer permits. But the price per unit for pollution is going to remain the same. Okay? So, but the thing is, this is pretty effective in driving down the quantity of pollution. This approach, in this case, where you have an increase in pollution control technology, is very effective in driving down the quantity of pollution. Because of this perfectly elastic curve supply of pollution permits. Pollution permits is a perfectly elastic supply. Okay? Now, the other case where you have a fixed number of pollution permits, let's think about that a second. So again, an increase in technology would reduce the demand for pollution permits. But if there's a fixed number here, here's the supply of permits, or a fixed amount of pollution is allowed here, then well, if this is the regime, if you will, an advance in technology will not drive down the quantity of pollution. Okay? The same number of pollution permits are going to be demanded. The same quantity is going to be exchanged between the government and the factories along the river. However, the price per bit does go down, okay? So there is the same amount of pollution. But the price per solution, or cost per to pollute, let's put it this way, it decreases. The price to pollute per unit or cost decreases. Okay? Decreases. Can y'all read my writing today? Okay. Okay, so, you know, if the goal here, if you're a policymaker and you think you're regulating an industry here in which there's advances in the offing regarding, you know, pollution, you know, the ability to produce electricity or whatever it is, rubber tires, whatever it is, in a cleaner way, if there's advances in the offing, then you might, as a policymaker, prefer this particular approach. But they're both market-based approaches, really. But in this case here, if they can exchange the permits, if you have a fixed number of permits and letting them exchange, we've seen how that works pretty well. But really, the corrective tax may be the one that's most effective in driving down the amount of pollution. Okay, so that's kind of one kind of interesting problem here. This is problem number 7 in your text. I think everything else in this chapter here is, as far as I'll post some solutions for you guys, and you can look at that in working this chapter. Also be sure and look at the helps I put up on MindTap. There's some interesting things about carbon taxes in your book on page 202. You might want to read that. Yes, some results from surveys of economists. I think these are kind of, sometimes these are kind of blow me away a little bit because maybe I don't think like many others in my field, but this is one here with carbon taxes. The Brookings Institute, which is not exactly the most conservative, but it's out there, institution, recently described a U.S. carbon tax of $20 per ton of junk pumped in the air would be taxed at $20. Increasing at 4% a year, which would raise an estimated $150 billion per year in federal revenues over the next decade. Okay, can y'all read that? Given the negative externalities created by carbon dioxide emissions, a federal carbon tax at this rate would involve fewer harmful net distortions to the U.S. economy than a tax increase that generates the same revenue by raising the marginal tax rates on labor income across the board. So at any rate, these two findings here, I kind of want to look at as what do economists say? Economists, 95% would agree with this statement here, that a tax on carbon content of fuels would be a less expensive way to reduce carbon dioxide emissions than would a collection of policies such as, you know, CAFE, corporate average fuel economy requirements for automobiles. Okay, so basically what they're saying here is that the carbon tax is the most efficient way than the more heavy-handed regulatory approach. You know, let firms, you know, that produce carbon dioxide as an emission in the air, let them determine how much to pollute so long as they pay the tax. That would be a more efficient way. Then the government coming in and saying, hey, you can only produce so much, you know, gasoline company, petroleum company that sells gasoline. If you say, hey, you can only sell so much gasoline because that gasoline pollutes, puts carbon dioxide in the air, that's more of a heavy-handed, command and control is the term your book uses here, approach. Okay, so a tax would be a more efficient way. And I think most of us would agree with that. It seems to me like that's probably reasonable. Carbon taxes are a better way to implement climate policy than cap and trade. Not so much agreement here. Okay, but this is kind of interesting to me. I would have expected more economists to have agreed with the cap and trade approach, okay, than with carbon taxes. But this survey of economists said not 79% agree with this statement here. Okay, so at any rate, those are some neat kind of statements here in your book. Kind of have to read those carefully to make sure you can understand what they're saying here.
What page was that?
That's on page 202 of your text, page 202. Okay, so there's a lot there to chew on in that chapter, I think. But this is kind of, this chapter kind of goes with the next one just a little bit, because when we talk about externalities, especially negative externalities, they're associated with what we call common resources. We're going to talk about basically two different kinds of goods. There are four kinds of goods, really, but we're going to focus on two of four kinds of goods in the next chapter. Common goods will be one of the four, as we'll see here in just a second. And when you have common goods, you have negative externalities, okay? We'll look at an example here in just a minute. On page 212, they talk about different kinds of goods in this diagram here. Okay. There are four kinds of goods. We kind of, as in our economics so far, looking at markets, we've kind of focused on private goods, okay? These are right here. So that's my house, okay? That's my car, what have you, okay? Those are private goods. They're private because they manifest two traits. They are both rivalrous in consumption, and they're excludable. Okay, so this is a little two-dimensional system here that gives us four categories of goods, and we want to distinguish between these four. We're going to identify or define four types of goods here. And so we're starting with private goods, and this is kind of what we've focused on first off when we've talked about, things that are traded in the marketplace generally. Bananas and apples and cars and what have you are private goods. They have two aspects or two features. They're excludable. To be excludable, they define this for you in your text right here. It's the property of a good whereby a person can be prevented from using it. So if that Dodge Charger out there in the parking lot, that's mine, okay? So I don't mean to be selfish about it, but I would appreciate it if you want to drive my Dodge Charger today, please come and get the keys and ask, okay? I'm being facetious. But the thing is, I can use the full weight of the law to keep somebody from taking my car that's parked out in the parking lot. It's excludable, okay? I can exclude others from consuming what I consume. So that's excludability. Okay, a private good is excludable, okay, because we're here at the top part of this axis. It's also it's rivalrous in consumption. Sorry, I said non, but it's rivalrous in consumption. That basically, like for my car, that means if you're going to go drive my car today, I can't drive it. Okay, two people can't enjoy the good at the same time. Rivalry in consumption is the property of a good whereby one person's use diminishes another person's use. Okay, so an automobile would be a private good because it manifests, first off, excludability. If you own the automobile, then that means a non-owner can be excluded from using your automobile. Also means that if you're actually using your automobile, no one else can use it. Okay? There's not like an infinite number of users for my automobile at one point in time. Ice cream cones, clothing, so forth, and congested toll roads, okay? Think about this a second. And we're going to look at different roads here. Congested toll road is a private good. Why? Say if the Broken Arrow, the Muskogee Turnpike, I drive that, I have to have a pike pass, okay? To get on, I have to pay for it, okay? If I don't pay for it, I get excluded. So the right to drive on the turnpike is an excludable good. If I don't pay for it, I get excluded. And there's heavy traffic too. Guess what? That means it's rivalrous in consumption. That means when I get on the turnpike, makes it a little bit more difficult for someone else to use the turnpike if it's congested. Does that make sense? So you have both excludability and rivalry when it comes to a congested turnpike. Now, if the turnpike were not congested, okay, then it would no longer be rivalrous. Okay, like if we come over here, the turnpike is uncongested. Okay, if there's, at midnight, there's nobody on the turnpike. Just because I get on the turnpike doesn't mean someone else can't get on the turnpike, or it's more difficult for them. So in that case, the uncongested toll road, it's an excludable good because you still got to pay the toll to get on the toll road, but you're not excluding someone else by being on the toll road. So an uncongested toll road would be in this category here, which we call a club good. Club goods are excludable, but not rivalrous. Look at these other goods, like satellite TV. Okay, satellite TV. You get used to it as a dish, whatever. All right, so anybody can buy one of those. Just because you turn on, if I can use dish for a second, but you turn your dish on and watch a show, doesn't mean the signal to my house goes down. I mean, I don't get the lights get dimmer or something. I can't see the show because you're watching it now. In other words, satellite TV is non-rivalrous in consumption. However, it is excludable. Why is satellite TV excludable?
Not everybody has it.
Okay, now why does not everybody have it though?
Because they cost money to implement.
Okay, because you got to buy the subscription, right? Like over here with the toll road, you have to buy a Pike Pass. So that's what you're saying is exactly correct. But we exclude these people who don't buy the permits or the subscription. So they're excludable. Fire protection can be excludable too. Believe it or not, and there's been cases of this, where in certain cities in the Northeast, if your house is on fire, fire truck comes out there, woo, stops, and they look for a little medallion in front of your house. If the medallion's there, it means you paid for your fire service that month. And they'll get the hose out and put the fire out. But if they don't see the medallion there, they're going to say, you're free riding, okay, or trying to free ride. We'll talk about the free rider problem later. We don't have time today. But fire protection can be excludable. Now, we don't think of that so much in the state of Oklahoma because, the county or city fire department is going to come out and put your house out, regardless of whether or not you paid your property taxes or not, right? Or you've been buying. Have you been buying your groceries online and not paying the sales tax? The use tax? Shame on you, right? No, they don't make that a set. They'll come out and put your house out. But it is feasible to exclude people from fire protection because they haven't paid for it. It is excludable. And so forth. So goods that are excludable but non-rivalrous are called club goods. Now, I suppose, there's always a little fuzzy line between these, is that, in California recently with all the fires they had, okay, it was not exactly a non-rivalrous situation. If somebody was putting your house fire out, they weren't putting someone else's house fire out. But generally speaking, you don't have that situation like that. You don't have that many fires going on at once, okay? All right, so, and there's these other categories too. So you got common resources here. The common resources, they are rivalrous but not excludable. Okay, so fish in the ocean and so forth. If you fish a whole bunch, especially lobster harvesting and so forth, that means the other farmers can't get as many, but it's kind of hard to keep those people out. So they're not excludable, but they are rivalrous. Spend a little time with this and get to public